Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today on practical leadership skills for global diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're here today with the Center for Intercultural Leadership at UC Berkeley, and we're so glad that you've joined us. As you're coming into today's event, I hope you'll take a moment to find the chat. We love to interact with you in chat throughout the event, and I will ask you to please use the drop-down menu to select all panelists and attendees so that everyone who's participating in today's event can benefit from your wisdom and questions and can engage and interact with you. So if you could take a moment to let us know that you've found the chat, I'd love to know where you're calling in from today. And if you have anything interesting to say about the weather, or if you're here today and you're representing an organization and you want to give a shout out to the organization that you're a part of, we'd love to see that in the chat as well. So welcome to Melissa in Portland, Oregon. Welcome in Atlanta. Welcome in London. Welcome in snowy Ann Arbor, which is not so far from me. It's bitterly cold today where we are. Welcome in London, in Champaign-Urbana, in Munich, Germany. Wow, it's coming so fast. I can't really read it fast enough. I do see that Gordon is here on behalf of One Spirit Learning Alliance in New York City. So shout out to you all. Thank you for being a part of today's event. Wow, those came in fast. So thank you so much for joining us today. And as we begin to get started, I want to let you know about a few things. One is that if you're interested in live tweeting your learning from today's event, we will be using the hashtag CIL Global Diversity. So for those of you who enjoy tweeting, we would love to have you capture and share your insights with your followers on Twitter so that others can find out about the great work that's happening at CIL. So thanks again for those of you who have been engaging with us in the chat. Before we dive into today's content, I want to take a moment to introduce our panelists. I'll start with Dr. Jason Patton. He is the Director and Intercultural Training Specialist at CIL. We also have Grace Michael, who's Assistant Director and Intercultural Training Assistant. And we have Brianna Bellamy, who's an Intercultural Training Specialist. And before we dive too far, it would be great if you could share a little bit with us about the work that the Robertson Center is doing in the world these days. And then we also want to take a moment to get to know more of you who are on the call. So just a sneak peek for that.
Thanks so much, Becky. I'll just take a couple minutes to introduce the Robertson Center for Intercultural Leadership, or CIL as we go by shorthand. And CIL is a center for training and developing people's skills to work effectively across cultural differences. And we live at International House at UC Berkeley, which is a living and learning community. And during non-pandemic times, iHouse is a place where we have scholars and students from around the world, over 70 countries, about 600 people living under one roof, studying together, learning together, eating and sleeping, and really just having this kind of global village. And our office was started there about 7 years ago to really be a place to equip both the residents of International House as well as other folks at UC Berkeley with these intercultural skills to navigate differences of all kinds and really leverage difference as an asset. And then since then, we've grown and developed and expanded our programs to work with different clients around the world. And we do a lot of different workshops, training programs, and we focus on this global aspect of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which you're going to hear quite a bit more about as we share more about what we do today. And we also do this from the perspective of leadership. So we are the Center for Intercultural Leadership. So when we talk about leadership, we're talking about the ability to, wherever you are, whether you're in a position of formal authority, leading an organization formally or not, what influence do you have to build a place where inclusion and belonging is the norm, where we have equity in our workplaces, and what can you do from any position that you're in to move the needle on that. And so it's really leadership at all levels. And we want people to walk away from engaging in our learning experiences feeling like they have something practical that they can go and do right now, tomorrow, to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in their workplaces and in their lives. So that's a little bit about what we do, and we're gonna share some specifics about that throughout this webinar today.
Thank you so much, Grace. So now we want to take a moment to get to know a bit about those of you who have chosen to invest an hour of your time with us today. And we're curious about what role you serve in your organizations. And so I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll. We would love to invite you to participate in the poll. It's possible that you're here today and you serve in a DEI role internally in an organization. Potentially, you could be a facilitator, coach, or consultant working in an organization. Maybe you are looking to become a facilitator, coach, or consultant in the DEI space. Potentially your role isn't explicitly focused on DEI, but you feel that DEI is an important initiative or other, and you can let us know in the chat about what other category you represent. So we'll give you a few moments to answer the poll, and also just sending out support to those of you in the chat who have said that you're in places where you're without power, and how amazing that you've found a way to log into to today's event despite those challenges. So we appreciate you being here. I'll give you a few more moments to answer that poll. And interesting to see who is representing their organizations and what their roles are. So I see an other in the chat. Mary is a US-based faculty teaching cross-cultural topics to students in ANZ. Is that New Zealand? So I'm going to end the poll and share those results. Australia, New Zealand. Wow, is it the middle of the night in Australia, New Zealand? Amazing. And Katinka is an executive coach specializing in women in top management. Looks like Susie is Assistant Director of HR, Director of Training, serving as a chairperson for DEI committee. So thanks to those of you who are sharing your role in the chat. And let's look at these results together. It looks like 42% of you are not explicitly focused on DEI, but feel that it's important. And then just a wide range of others. You know, some people serving internally in a DEI role, some facilitators, coach, consultants, and others who are looking to become facilitators, coaches, or consultants. So thank you so much for taking the time to share. And we will have some other polls. Did I share that on my screen? We will have some other polls later on in today's event. So let's dive into today's topic. I know we want to start with this idea of global diversity and how it's different when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in general. So Brianna, can you help us differentiate what you mean when you say global diversity?
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the things I really want to highlight in that question is where we focus, sort of what makes CIL work unique in this space, why we say global DEI, which is that we're really working at the intersection of two fields that are deeply complementary and yet rarely brought together with any kind of intentionality. And that's the field of intercultural leadership. You can see that in our name. And then, of course, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And intercultural leadership field has really have a proven history and a vast array of skills, practices, frameworks that really support people from diverse cultural backgrounds to work together effectively to build understanding across difference and to adapt, right? However, the intercultural field has also traditionally had a pretty huge gap, and that is an absence of any kind of power analysis, any kind of critical eye to the influences of power dynamics, of privilege, of the structural challenges that can create inequities. And so that's where diversity, equity, and inclusion comes in. And the diversity, equity, and inclusion field has a ton of best practices that really bring in this lens of recognizing the influence of power dynamics, how these dynamics can influence and are reinforced by our systems and structures, and how they can become embedded in our cultural norms. So when we bring these two fields together, we're really able to leverage these intercultural frameworks, these skills that can help to build more inclusive practices in order to tackle the DEI challenges while maintaining that focus on addressing the critical challenges to equity and inclusion and holding those with more power and influence accountable to be the ones sort of doing the adapting, engaging that wider community in really critically problem solving With this also, we've noticed that in the DEI field, at least here in the US, there tends to be a very US-centric focus on how we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that can be, there can be a lack of inclusion then in that way in global organizations or global teams, that we lose people. It's not inclusive of this global perspective. Every country, every culture has its own challenges around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and has been trying to solve it in many different ways. And we have a lot to learn from each other to really expand our view and how we tackle these really global challenges, as well as those for us right here at home in the US. And with that, we also recognize we don't necessarily just mean globally dispersed teams, but here in the US and in many places in the world, you can have super diverse, culturally diverse, different definitions of diverse in one place, in one team, in one community. And so how can you leverage these skills to really be effective in creating inclusive initiatives and cultures in your community and your organizations?
That's super helpful, Brianna. So I appreciate you giving us that context for really understanding what global diversity is and what you mean when you say that. And I'm thrilled that we have some diversity in terms of our participants in today's event. So we're definitely open to any questions or comments throughout the event from those of you who are dialing in here in the US and around the world. So as we go a little farther, I'd love for us to spend some time talking about what inclusion means to us on this call. I think, Jason, you're going to tackle that question.
Becky. So the question, what does inclusion mean to you? It's obviously a huge question. I think it's personal for a lot of us. And I want to share just a little bit kind of from my experiences that also ties back to the work that we do at CIL. So I think the experience of feeling left out or feeling like we don't belong is a universal part of human experience. We all have examples in our lives of how that plays out, and I'm no exception to that. It's like a core aspect of human experience. We know what it feels like we know what it feels like to belong, and we know what it feels like not to belong. And we know how different those feelings are. And, as a human being, I've had many experiences of feeling like I don't belong. But here's the crucial difference. What I didn't have growing up in the United States in a white male supremacist society as a cisgender white man, I did not have the experience of feeling systemically or systematically excluded based on who I am. In fact, quite the opposite. And of course, I didn't know this growing up, but all of the images and messages that I received growing up were that what I was normal and something to be aspired to. And as I continue to grow and learn as an adult, this contrast between this individual one-off kind of experience of not belonging versus the systemic, it just grows stronger and stronger, and gets me more and more committed to doing this work. Because when I try to imagine what it must be like to feel that I'm excluded because of who I am, it's been such a profound ongoing realization for me. So to me, so much of the commitment to inclusion has to do with focusing in on what can we do, and also how can folks with more privilege, like cisgender white men such as myself, what are the actual skills that we need to build and the efforts that we need to take so that we can address things on a more systemic level and really hold ourselves accountable to be doing more of the recognition of what's going on inside of our own minds, and then actually taking on the task of adapting our behaviors towards others so that we can bring people in and have people who have been systemically excluded be included. I want to give one really quick example because it ties in with the work that we do. So one of the content areas, and we're going to talk a little bit later in more detail about the content that we get into, but one of the favorite topics that folks have that we address is conflict style. How we approach conflict and the default ways in which we deal with conflict in conflict situations is a really popular topic. And there's a model that we use. It's not our model. It's called the Intercultural Conflict Style Inventory. And the basic idea is that we tend to communicate either more directly or more indirectly And we tend to be either more emotionally expressive or more emotionally restrained. And that gives you 4 conflict styles. And my conflict style is what's called engagement, which is direct communication and emotional expressiveness. The dominant professional style here in the United States is something called discussion, which is direct communication and emotional restraint. That it's just, we're not licensed to be emotionally expressive. And we have all kinds of negative ideas about folks who are emotionally expressive, especially in conflict situations. So I've had the experience of feeling excluded and actually feeling like I've had bad things happen to me professionally because of my conflict style. And that's not good. But white men aren't stereotyped consistently as being emotionally expressive. What would it be like? I've asked myself, what would it be like if I were being emotionally expressive and I were a white woman? What if I were a Black woman? And feeling like I have to be apologetic for who I am, and that if I'm being emotionally expressive, I'm risking being perceived as othered, as someone other because of the stereotypes that we have in our society about emotional expressivity associated with certain identity groups. So that's sort of this personal experience, this one-off feeling excluded versus this more systemic approach, which is the approach we try to take in our work. So there's obviously a lot more to say about that, but that's all I'm going to say on this topic for now. Becky, looks like it's muted you.
Thank you. Jason, thank you so much for sharing that great example with us. And I know what we want to think about is how these skills are trained. So there's first this level of awareness to these differences that might exist and how to include others. And I know that CIL focuses on training for skills. So I'd love to hear, Grace, about how CIL goes about training, what your approach is, and how that results in behavior change in people.
Becky, yeah, I mean, I think with Jason, Brianna, and I, the reason that we do the work that we do and what we love is to see people have real transformative learning experiences and these aha moments where there's recognition that can then shift into real behavior change. And so what we do and what we also equip others to do, because we also train other people to be trainers or facilitators of this kind of work, is that we lead people through processes of having experiences with us in a learning environment, in a classroom. We'll do things like simulations, interactive games, role plays, which I know some people really hate, but we do it because we learn by doing. And we know that adult learning happens when people can, first of all, have an experience and then like reflect back on that experience. What just happened? What did I feel? What was going on? Then we connect that to these concepts, these tools, these theoretical frameworks, kind of zoom out and say, okay, this is actually, you know, what we just experienced, this role play that you saw about people in conflict. What you just saw are these, you know, 3 different conflict styles in action, and we give those things names, and then we give people skills to go and practice working with those in different ways, to actually try new skills, new ways of interacting with people. So in its most basic level, we call this the self-other bridge model. We start with self-awareness, building a sense of understanding of who am I, what are my values that are influenced by my identity, my culture, my background, what lens do I see the world through? And then we helped them to build awareness of other people's cultural identities, values, and preferences and behaviors. And then we help people identify the practical bridging strategies. These are skills and everyday actions they can do to bridge the gap between people who are different than them. So through that self-awareness and other awareness and bridging, we believe that people can communicate and work more effectively across all of these differences. But the how of how we do that is through this experiential learning and training process. We even use VR technology is something that we've recently integrated into our repertoire to help people. We'll give them like a tool or a skill set, and then they'll actually go and practice going into a room with a virtual avatar to have to practice those bridging strategies, because we believe that, you know, it's, you learn by doing, and a lot of this stuff, it's embedded in our bodies, our automatic and unconscious behaviors and our reactions to cultural differences, those are embedded in our bodies and our nervous systems. So we have to try something different and repeatedly try it and practice it to bring about that behavior change. So that's how we approach training. And we really, I think, you have to start with yourself and understanding your own identity and different preferences, just like Jason was mentioning with understanding his conflict style. And we have a whole range of different tools and frameworks that help us to name and describe those different styles, which we want to talk a little bit more about with you all here today, I think.
Yes, we want to invite some more interaction and engagement from you. And the poll that I'm about to launch references a number of different inclusion skills that CIL focuses on helping people to improve. And so we'd love to know, of these inclusion skills, which are most relevant to you right now in your organizations. And we have several: interrupting unconscious bias, inclusive communication and collaboration, managing conflict, leading and motivating diverse teams, courageous dialogue on polarizing topics, and giving and receiving feedback. And we've set up the poll so that you can answer more than one topic that might be relevant to you. And we'll use your responses to this poll to inform some of our upcoming conversation on the call. So thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts, because what you share will directly impact some content that we'll share from here. So thanks to those of you who are putting questions and comments in the chat as well. It's so great to get a glimpse of the type of work, important work, that many of you are doing in the world. So Jason, I had seen a question while folks are answering the poll. I did see that you put the answer in the chat related to your conflict style. It seems like that's a topic that's definitely interesting to folks on the call. And Crystal's actually asking Grace for some clarification related to self-other bridge analysis. If you could potentially answer that question while people finish the poll.
Great, yeah, and I want to say a little bit more about that too. So we call it our self-other bridge model. So it starts with self-awareness. So for example, I'm a US American woman. I grew up in California. My mother is a refugee from Myanmar. My father is European American, been here for 4 generations. And so I start with this awareness of, like, with this identity that I hold, what are some of the ways that I show up and behave in the world? You know, well, I know that I have a really strong value for family and ancestry and for peace. And that actually comes from my family's experience being people who escaped war. I also, growing up in California, I have a strong value for a casual lifestyle and culture that shows up in how I dress, in how I spend my weekends out in nature. And so we look at, what are my values? And then what are my behaviors? How's the way I show up in the world? And that's that piece of self-awareness. But also with that, there's self-awareness of how I show up in the workplace. How do I show up in conflict? Do I tend to be a more direct communicator or a more indirect communicator? Do I wear my expressions on my face, or do I keep them to myself, my emotions, that is? And those are some of the things that Jason was starting to talk about and that we dig into through this lens of understanding different intercultural communication styles, behaviors, leadership styles, etc. So starting with that self-awareness, and then other awareness. How do I learn how to recognize that in others? How do I learn how to see that somebody else is showing up in the world based on a really complex identity that they hold and different cultural values that they hold, and something that I might not like or that I might find to be difficult? It might not be a personality thing, but it's actually culturally influenced. And how can I start to notice that there are patterns and ways that we can understand people from these diverse identities and backgrounds that help us get to the point of, well, you make sense to me. There's not something wrong with you. It makes sense to me that you're communicating like that because in your culture and in your family group or your identity group, it's normal, for example, for people to all talk over each other at once, as opposed to like talk spaced out. And that's not rude or interrupting, it's just different. And so we can get to that place of, you make sense to me. And then the bridging the gap. Okay, then, well, what can I do then? If your way of communicating is different than my way, it makes sense to me, but we're still not really connecting. One of us or both of us has to take steps towards one another to bridge the gap. And how do we adapt our behavior accordingly? And with that comes this question of, well, whose responsibility is it to adapt? And who in this situation is basically in a place of where my style is the norm. My style is maybe the dominant style in our culture, in our organization. And that's where this question of inclusion and belonging is really critical, because typically the people who feel most included are the people whose norms have just been the dominant norm in their organizational culture. And so we're challenging people to recognize, hey, maybe you've been living in a situation where you've had the privilege of not having to think about adapting your behavior to be inclusive of other styles that are different. Or maybe you've always been the one having to adapt and code switch, and that's exhausting, and that's a huge emotional burden. So how can organizations and workplaces start getting this greater recognition that there's people in their teams that are doing that adapting, and then those who have more organizational authority, power, and privilege can take it on themselves to do more adapting to others and be more inclusive. So it's that's a bit of a long explanation to your question, but we call it the self-other bridge model.
It's very helpful. So I'm going to share these results. It looks like the most popular topic from our list is courageous dialogue on polarizing topics. But, you know, at least 40% of you are interested in all the topics. So we are going to dive in to this idea of what are some of the skills that you at CIL are addressing with folks, and you know, potentially we're going to touch on some of these ones that we just identified.
Okay, so I'll chat a little bit about this now. Grace actually touched on this a lot in her answer to the question about the self-other bridge model. But I'll just give a couple more concrete examples around that. So fundamentally, you can think self-awareness and other awareness. You could think about those as just awareness. You could also think about those in terms of skills. And I'll come back to that in a second. But the focus really of the work that we do more than anything else is on the bridging piece. And for all of these different topic areas, we are eventually driving towards what we call bridging strategies. And you can think of bridging strategies as things that you do differently than you would be inclined to do if your automatic brain were just telling you what to do. In other words, bringing intentionality to our actions in very specific ways. And since we've been talking about conflict style, I'll just give a couple of examples. So as somebody with an engagement style, and again, so the engagement style is direct communication with emotional expressiveness. So if say, Becky, I don't know what your conflict style is, but let's for argument's sake, let's say it's discussion, right? So let's say that you're direct communication with emotional restraint, and we find ourselves in a conflict situation. There's what we want to be able to do in managing conflicts. What we want to be able to do is recognize that we're in a triggered state, that the threat response is active, and calm down that threat response so that then we can get onto the content of whatever it is that we're having a conflict about. But we're so often we're so wrapped up in how annoyed we are by the other person because of their annoying conflict style that we can't even get to that. And so we focus on what are the specific things that we can do to bridge to others with different conflict styles. So you can think about this in terms of don'ts and do's. So one thing you wouldn't want to do is you wouldn't want to say, Jason, will you please just calm down? Mm-hmm. You might have an intention of calming me down, but that's going to have the opposite effect. For somebody with an engagement style, it's like, calm down, there's a problem that I'm being emotionally expressive, and whoop, up we go. On the other hand, an effective bridging strategy is, Jason, I understand how you feel. Something that simple. And then, thank you, Becky. Thank you so much for validating my feelings. Right, so that's an important step forward in the process. And that's one example of a bridging strategy. Your discussion conflict style might be telling you, I need to tell this guy to calm down. But because you've done this work, you're recognizing, right, Jason has an engagement conflict style. I've got a discussion conflict style. What are those strategies? Right. Jason, I understand how you feel. Great. So that's one example. Another example is, and this really brings in the cultural piece more. And we always have to be careful when we're talking in these terms, because we want to avoid stereotyping and overgeneralizing, and also recognize the uniqueness of every individual, while also recognizing that behaviors pattern with culture. And so I'm going to make the following statement, which is actually backed up by research. I've spent a lot of years living and working in China, and the predominant conflict style in China is a style called accommodation, which is indirect communication and emotional restraint, which is the diametric opposite of my preferred conflict style. So I had a position of a leadership position in my previous job to this one. And I had to learn very quickly that there were specific bridging strategies that I needed to use on a daily basis. If I was feeling upset about something, don't let it show. Find other ways, and also ways of decoding communications, because I rely on people, because of the direct communication piece of this, I rely on people saying exactly what they're thinking, but that wasn't happening. So I had to learn to decode and also encode, in other words, how to speak in a way that was less direct, and also interpret indirect speech in accurate ways as well. So there's lots and lots of skills that have to be built in terms of the bridging strategies for individuals, and also how these pattern on a cultural basis also. And then one other piece on the skills. So that you think of the bridging strategies as outwardly visible behaviors, but there's also a lot of skills that are simply around how we manage our perception of others. And this is where we get into the values piece that Grace was talking about. If we can learn to recognize behaviors that we find problematic, that make us feel like other people are annoying, if we can learn to see those as a function of our own set of values and behavioral norms, and then also to see it in terms of their values, though you make sense to me piece, then that's an important skill set to learn as well. So in other words, if I might think, oh, these people, they're so passive aggressive. Why can't they just say what's on their mind and be real? That's the engagement part of me speaking. That's a really different thing from saying, oh, okay, harmony is a closely held value in this culture. And that is prioritized over, say, authenticity or transparency, which is the main value that drives me as somebody with an engagement conflict style. And if I can identify with the value of harmony. So if I can connect the behaviors to the values, that's also a really important skill set to build as well. That's just a couple examples of how our work is focused on building skills.
That's really helpful. So Jason, are we going to dive into some of the topics that we identified in the poll and how you develop those skills in people? There was a particular interest, I believe, in, somebody help me remember, the most important one that came out in the poll was related to polarizing topics.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, all of this really ties together. All of the different skills that we focus on really support one another. And some of what Jason was just talking about, building that self-other awareness around our styles and our quick evaluations of other ways of being in the world, right? So I think that's one level, right? I did notice a couple comments ago in the chat. This chat is very alive right now, which I love. There was something about sort of unconscious bias versus conscious biases, and how do we interrupt those different ways that biases show up. And, one really key piece around the perception management that comes out in these conversations is kind of that baseline to really check ourselves and our biases, and the quick way that we jump to evaluations and interpretations of others' behaviors, actions. So that perception management piece is one of the skills that we really focus in on as really a foundational skill for all of the content that we train people, and all the skills that people are building. So when that comes into, some of the conversation around polarizing topics, right? And how do we lead courageous dialogues here? Another level of that is managing our perception, also noticing our emotions. When we go into that threat response, the amygdala, that part of our brain that is scanning the environment for threats and often sees difference as a threat, it interprets difference as a threat. It it will go off and it floods our brain. We call it the amygdala hijack because it literally hijacks your brain. It takes over and cuts off access to the part of your brain that's responsible for all of the higher thinking, our neocortex, which is responsible for collaboration, for trust building, for creativity and problem solving. Those are all skills that are necessary if we're going to try to have conversations about difficult and polarizing topics, right? Yet, if we are in amygdala hijack, if we let that stress response take over, we're not going to have access to that part of our brain that's going to allow us to build trust across difference and to engage in problem solving conversations and collaboration. And really, when it comes to having conversations around polarizing topic, we need that kind of creativity and that kind of trust. So that's one of the foundational skills, as well as how do we have that emotional management as well, so that we can have some more agency about how we show up to these conversations. And then it's about also recognizing, again, that self-awareness about where our own edges are, where our own growth edges are, what we call our courageous edge, in being able to have these conversations. And how can we notice where those are? So I think we have a workshop where Grace has some great examples around responding to microaggressions, right? And moments of building awareness where she was able to speak up in a context of microaggression, and a space where it wasn't possible in that moment for her. And like, how can we look at ourselves and our own growth and our own edges so that we can see where we can be pushing that forward and being able to be more courageous. I'm getting a little distracted by the chat in here because I see more questions coming in. I want to make sure I'm also answering those.
Yeah. No worries. We'll get to the questions for sure. It looks like someone is specifically asking you a question, Brianna, so I'll read that in case you want to address it now. Manisha is wondering if you could talk more about how power and privilege show up in these conversations and bridge building. For some groups, existing trauma and inequities impact the way they're able to practice those skills and emotional management.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And this is such an important piece, because one of the things that we recognize in this work, particularly for folks who are from traditionally marginalized groups or who have been targets of oppressive systems and behaviors, is that what we're really working with in many ways is trauma, right? And we need to honor and acknowledge that and keep space for that. So for those communities, so for BIPOC communities here in the US and people of different marginalized identities in other contexts as well, honoring that and working with boundaries and support systems, right? So working to recognize where are your supports, be that in your workplace or in your community, and to actively be developing those support systems, because this is a burden that has been carried, right, for generations. And as a person of color, I deeply resonate with this. The feeling for me has often been like, just like screaming out and no one even acknowledging, that something is happening, right? And that is deeply exhausting. And I have been nourished by finding communities that are able to share this understanding and share strategies together and support one another. So I think that's really important. The other piece here is we do ask this question: who is responsible for the adapting and the bridging? And I think, Grace and Jason both touched on this, that we really want to focus on that self-awareness too for those who have not had to do the adapting, and that we really place the onus on them to be doing more adapting, right? Mm-hmm. And to be able to have the skills to recognize where they're not adapting and where they need to be adapting, and the impact of not adapting on individuals and on their organizations and communities.
So what I'm hearing is the people with the power need to do the adapting. The people who are in the majority need to do the adapting. And those people who are enjoying privilege are the ones who need to do the adapting.
Exactly.
It's very challenging. Grace, did you want to add something?
Yeah, and I completely agree with what Brianna just said, and I think you summed it up nicely, Becky. And this is an ongoing process of unlearning, because this those positions of power and privilege that folks from traditionally privileged backgrounds occupy in our culture, there's typically not awareness of that. It's typically, we have this quote that we reference a lot by Adrienne Rich, that all privilege is ignorant at the core. So there's an ignorance to privilege. And so a big part of the work is also bringing awareness to the fact that these power and privilege dynamics are at play, and helping people to get into spaces to start to come into consciousness and reckoning with the different unearned advantages that they hold.
Thank you.
I'd like to add one piece to that also, just building on this notion of all privilege is ignorant at the core. I found it really helpful just to think about this, just try to pull, it's very easy to see a statement like that and feel insulted. Feel that, like, to feel like, you calling me ignorant, right? To sort of get into a battle about that. And I think it's extremely important to fight that impulse, to quiet that impulse, and just kind of sink into the truth of that statement and reckon with that and think, well, what does that mean? How does that play out? Because the more, when I'm able to, and I mean, I've got my own battle, my mind is at battle with itself all the time in a lot of ways, right? So it's not like this, like at any given moment I have clarity, but in the moments of greater clarity, what I keep coming back to is the logic is airtight, that ignorance is the natural state of privilege. Okay, well, if the factuality of that can't be denied, well, then what are the implications? There's a lot of implications. It means I'm not qualified to speak on a whole lot of things. And what I really need to do is listen to the lived experiences of others, take them in, and not, and sure, there's liable to be a voice in my head pushing back, saying, well, what about this? And what about, whataboutism going on in my own mind? What about this? What about that? So recognize that, and then say, okay, that's great. Thank you for sharing. Now I'm going to continue listening, always listening and trying to take this in. And then it also helps us to see, to take other perspectives as the gift that they are, because the remedy for ignorance is the experiences of others. It's information, it's context, it's like taking things in from other sources and letting that become a part of how I perceive the world and how I interact with the world and the way that I see my role in the world. So I think I want to just invite all of us to quiet that impulse that we might have to fight it, and invite it in, and let that do its work on us over time.
So Jason, someone's asking for clarification on what you mean by privilege.
I think that the simplest kind of, I guess, synonym is unearned advantage. So, if somebody says, Jason, how did you end up in the position that you are? It's kind of a typical response. I think at least I'll keep it to U.S. American professional culture would be, oh, well, I went and got this fancy degree here, and I got this fancy degree there, and I worked really hard and all that. And that's like the story of how I got where I am. And so I'll tell the story about what sounds like, earned advantage. These are all the things that I did in order to get where I am. So sure, that's all true. Yes, fine. I got these fancy degrees and fine, I worked hard and all of that. But what about all that other stuff? How I'm responded to by the people around me has everything to do with the fact that I'm a cisgender white man. I mean, those are not the only three layers of culture or aspects of my identity that matter, but they're three extremely prominent ones in our culture. I'm not, and what doesn't happen to me as a result of that growing up in this culture here in the United States, which really, really focuses. And I do at some point want to, I wrote down Katinka's comment from earlier about white versus white supremacist, and I'll sort of put that to the side. I hope we can touch on that a little bit later. But unearned advantages, aspects, things that propel me forward, have me feeling like I belong, and also give me material advantages every single, not only every day, but really kind of every moment. And yeah, I'll stop talking there, and I want to see if Grace and Brianna have anything to correct or supplement what I just said.
I actually, I'm glad you brought up the comment around white supremacist culture, and I'm wondering if this is a good time. A question came in before the event today around white supremacy culture that Grace had some great thoughts on. Becky, do you have that?
I sure do. So Juanita wrote in, I don't know, Juanita, if you're here. If you are and you want to say hi in the chat. She mentioned that her organization's been on a journey to being an anti-racist organization for a long time and have made a ton of progress. They are now explicitly addressing white supremacy and how that shows up in their organizational culture. And she mentioned that she'd be curious to hear about your experiences in naming and addressing that specifically and what that looks like within an organization.
Sorry, let me unmute myself there. So yeah, thank you both, Jason and Brianna, for bringing this back around, because I think this, just like when we talk about privilege, and that word can sometimes be triggering for people. And I think somebody said in the chat that using the term unearned advantage can be a little bit more palatable for some folks. Similarly, the term white supremacy, I think, is immediately triggering and activating for a lot of folks. And when people hear the term white supremacy, they often associate it with the KKK, with white supremacist groups and ideologies. And it's immediately like, no, that's not me. I have nothing to do with that. I am not a racist. I am not a white supremacist. And people are trying to distance themselves from this and any association of that interpretation of white supremacy. And I think what we're trying to kind of unpack and get at here is that the reality is that we are all touched by white supremacy, and you don't have to hold conscious racist views or white supremacist views to still be an agent of white supremacy, especially in a US American context. Now, I know we talked before about global, but white supremacy has a very distinct flavor in the US. And white supremacy culture is this predominance and centering of white and Western values and behavioral norms. So it's essentially the practice of whiteness being the norm. And okay, so think about, have you ever heard somebody say about themselves, well, I don't really have a culture? I've heard this from lots of different white folks over the years. They'll say, oh, I don't really have a culture. Sometimes they'll say, I'll tell them about my background and they'll say to me, oh, you're so exotic. I don't really have a culture, right? And this is usually said with no malintent. It's sometimes even said like in that situation, like a compliment to me because, oh, you're more interesting than me. And it sometimes can be this self-deprecating thing that a white person might say. And regardless of their intent, the impact of that is actually that it communicates that white is normal and white is the standard, and anything else outside of that is different. And also for the white folks, there's a huge disconnect from their ancestry and their heritage, because whiteness is a construct that has been developed in the US. You know, people used to be English and Irish and German and all these other things. And so now there's like, oh, I don't have a culture. Well, it's actually been intentionally forgotten in the US to create whiteness as something that can maintain a certain power in our culture. And that's white supremacy culture, that white is standard, white is normal, white is the center. And there are other behavioral norms that are associated with white culture being the dominant culture, certain ways of speaking that are considered more professional, ways of wearing your hair and dressing, and not to mention then also how we run meetings, what we prioritize. Do we prioritize tasks over relationships? Do we prioritize efficiency and time over spaciousness? These are actually very Western white dominant norms that support a certain type of economy as well. So don't get me down that. But a huge part of raising awareness about white supremacy culture, if you want to try to address this in organizations, is to help folks first start to build self-awareness about their own identities, start to build awareness of how, yeah, actually everyone has a culture and we all have a history. We all have really complex identities that we're carrying around, and start to build other awareness of how there are so many different ways to exist and show up in the world than we might be aware of and that we consider to be the quote unquote norm. And once we have this awareness, then we can start asking ourselves, okay, what kind of culture do we want to create collectively that's more just and more inclusive?
What a powerful example, Grace. And I've noticed in the chat that other people agree. Really helpful framing to help us wrap our heads around what white supremacy culture is and what it means to have that unearned advantage that white people bring. Let's see. So we did have some other questions that came in prior to the webinar. And there's some other questions in the chat, but we do want a chance to go to some of the other questions that came in before the webinar, and we are grateful for you bringing those in. So this question is related to being a minority in the workplace, and the person who wrote in mentioned that they are the only person of color. And the question is, how do we encourage our people of color and minorities that they are placed in their roles not to meet the quota or by requirement, but because they really qualify for the job? And wondering in what way we can address those issues in the workplace.
Do you want me to tackle that one, team? I think that, yeah, I was looking at this question as I came through and just thinking about, it's so hard to be in that position, first of all, to be the only person of color in a group, and that feeling of the emotional labor. We've talked about that a little bit, but that pressure, but also I heard in that kind of a lack of safety about being the person who then is trying to bring up topics and initiate conversations around inclusion and diversity and equity. And the burden's really not the same for everyone. So this is why we are just continuously emphasizing that it's the responsibility of those with more formal authority to be doing more of the adapting, those with more identity privilege to be really the ones taking initiative to initiate conversations. So we need allies. And more than we talk about even this idea of being a conspirator. So just getting in the trenches, doing the work. We need more people who are stepping up and challenging their organizations to prioritize DEI. And it can be helpful if you are in a position where you do have capacity, where you do have the emotional bandwidth to raise those conversations, to go to your leadership and really point out how inclusive teams and diverse teams that are well managed outperform homogenous teams. So making that business case for inclusion and diversity. I don't think that, me personally, like, I don't care about the business case, I care about the human case, but the business case is real and research backs it up. And so we need to challenge organizations and say, if you want to have higher performance, you want a diverse team where that diversity is leveraged. And then in terms of at a more kind of day-to-day level, it can also be helpful to start with more community building activities that aren't explicitly about diversity issues, but allowing people to just bring their stories about themselves forward into the workplace. So we did this in our team, not in our team, in our whole organization at International House. We started a series called What Matters Most, which was essentially a storytelling series where people could just tell about what was important to them, like what they valued in life and how they were spending their time. And people got to know each other in this more relational community level. And then that becomes a foundation to include other kinds of diversity and share more about ourselves through the different lenses of who we are. So that can be like an early stage way to start to then pave the way for other diversity conversations, because all of this work is developmental in the sense that people are on different stages of development in the process. And we can't just skip stages and jump. We have to meet people where they're at.
Thanks so much. So I want to make sure that we have a chance to talk about the upcoming programs that the Robertson Center for Intercultural Leadership has available. And so I want to take a moment, and I'm not sure which one of you wanted to share about the upcoming programs, but just a quick summary of the programs that are open for registrations now. And you can find out more about CIL by visiting the CIL website. The team is also scheduling one-on-one conversations about the opportunities that are currently available. And there is also an informational session that's free tomorrow where you can dive in more to potentially enrolling in one of the programs that CIL has to offer. So I'm not sure who's on deck to talk about the programs that are currently open and open for enrollment for folks who want to get certified.
I'd be happy to, Grace and Brianna, I'd be happy to chat to this line. Okay. Well, the main program that we're focused on right now is our Global DEI Practitioner Institute. So over the years, we've gotten a lot of feedback from respondents, and a lot of folks have said a couple of things to us. One, a lot of folks want to get into this work. They want to be able to do the facilitation of workshops. And other folks have said, go and multiply yourselves. And that's something that we've wanted to do for a really long time, because you can probably, you've probably picked up on this during this webinar, but we're really motivated by impact. And we want to be able to use what we can offer to equip others to go out and kind of multiply, spread the impact. And so the Global DEI Practitioner Institute is our shot at doing this. And one of the ironies of COVID, of which there are so many, is that convening people has actually become so much easier than it was pre-COVID. And so we're now able to bring this to folks all over the world. And just in briefest terms, it's a 12-week, it's a pretty intensive program. It starts on March 9th and ends on May 27th. You can write us for more information about it, but fundamentally, it equips you to design and facilitate workshops. There's general theory of design and facilitation, but also the 6 content areas that we've talked about. You will be equipped to lead those workshops. And in addition to that, there's a capstone project where you'll design and facilitate your own workshop. And you also get certified in a number of online assessment tools that can help drive and measure diversity, equity, and inclusion results inside of organizations as well. So that's in a nutshell what it is. We have an info session coming up on Thursday, and we're also running a promotional discount through Friday. So please reach out to us if you want to learn more about that. We're also, we do custom engagements with organizations. If you want to bring us in, we can lead any of these workshops to you. We're virtual for, indefinitely, although it looks like things have turned a positive corner with COVID and we're heading in the right direction there. So we hope to be able to do things in person soon, just like all of you do. Mm-hmm. And there's other offerings as well, but the one that we're really focused on right now is the Institute. And so please feel free to reach out to us for more information on that.
And so we will be sending out a follow-up email very soon that will include the recording of today's event and all the links where you can find out more about the programs, including tomorrow's info session. And so thank you so much for investing time with us today. I know that I am thinking about so many things as a result of the chat and as a result of our conversations. And so I hope that you will check out what the Robertson Center for Intercultural Studies is up to and consider participating in the Institute or other programs that are offered. And I know we wanted to wrap up, Jason, with a reflection, sending us off on an optimistic note. So I'm going to let you close us up today.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm so appreciative of all of you taking an hour of your time and spending that with us today, and I hope it's been valuable for you. I also want to acknowledge just so many questions in the chat that we didn't have time to get to, that it's like, can we have 5 more hours, please? But that's not practical. So just thank you all for engaging in the chat too and asking us these questions. And I'm finding a lot of them are very challenging and interesting. But I did want to share one thought with you as we wrap up, which is something that's really stuck with me. When I interviewed for this position, gosh, it was 7.5 years ago. The last question, it was a Skype interview. I was living in Nanjing, China at the time. And the last question that they asked me was, is there anything about your personality that you think would make you good at this job? And I hadn't really thought about it, but what came out of my mouth was something like the following, which is, I've got a basic optimism about the human condition, which is, I feel like we have what it takes as a species to be so much more inclusive than we are, to have people feeling like they belong, able to bring their true selves, not hiding who they are, not be the targets of microaggressions day in and day out, feeling like they're less than. We have the equipment. It's like, it's why we have the equipment. We just have to learn how to use it. Now the just, you know, that's a big just. That is what all this work is about. And it is a gradual slog. And any of us in our lifetimes are only going to see so much progress. But I can't get away from what it seems to be the bedrock fact, is that human beings have what it takes. We have the equipment that we need, and we have to figure out how to use it. So I want to leave you all with that, and hopefully that's not too naive. Hopefully that's something that you can take with you. And thank you again, everybody, for spending time with us today.